So here we've written that the square root of 2 times by the square root of 2 must be 2, because that's what a square root means. What number that times by itself gives me that other number. So another thing that must be true, because 2 is the same as having 2 to the power of 1, is that when I multiply together the two powers of these numbers, I'll add them together. So we've got 2 to the power of something times by 2 to the power of something, but when I add them together it must be 1. Now obviously the two numbers have to be the same as well, so that tells us that those two numbers must be a half. So what that is telling us, if we look at this and this, is that 2 to the power of half must be the same as the square root of 2. And that is always true. So if I had, say, a 9 to the power of a half, that would be the same as having the square root of 9. If we look at the next statement below, which is also true, the cube root of 2 times by the cube root of 2 times by the cube root of 2 must also be 2. And again, 2 we know is the same as having 2 to the power of 1. So we should be able to write these as all as powers of 2. Now again, some number that when I add it to itself 3 times gives me 1, well, the only option there is that must be a third. So that tells me that 2 to the power of a third must be the same as having the cube root of 2. And again, that is also the same for any number. So let's have a look at making use of that. So here we've got 36 to the power of a half. And I know that if it's to the power of a half, then that is the same as finding the square root of 36. The square root of 36 is 6. 64 to the power of a third is a cube root. So we're going to find the cube root of 64. Cube root means what number times by itself, and times by itself again gives me 64. Well, that number must be 4. 81 to the power of a quarter, well, a quarter is going to represent the fourth root of 81. And that's what number do I times by itself, and times by itself again to get me 81. Well, that number is 3, because 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 gives me 81. 32 to the power of a fifth is going to be the fifth root of 32. So what number do I times by itself 5 times to get me 32? And that's 2. This one at the bottom involves a bit of skill from what we did last time. So it's got a negative indices. So if I know that it's going to be a minus, I can write that as 1 over. So I've got 1 over 4 to the power of a half. And I know that 4 to the power of a half is the same as having the square root of 4. And I know that the square root of 4 is 2. So I'd call that a half. This one, just a little step further. Instead of having a 1 on top of all the fractions, we've got different numbers here. But it's the same process that we follow. If I know that if it was 1/3, I would be cube rooting it. So all I'm going to do is cube root it first of all, to take care of this 3 part, and then I'm going to square it afterwards. So what I'm writing down is the cube root of 8, and then afterwards we're going to square it. So the cube root of 8 is 2, and then I'm going to square it, and that gives me 4. So here I'm going to take the square root of 16, and then I'm going to cube it, because that's what that part there tells me to do. Square root of 16 is 4, and then 4 cubed will give me 64. With this one, 32 to the power of 3 over 5, that's telling me, the 5 is telling me to take the fifth root, so we'll take the fifth root of 32, and then we're going to cube that. The fifth root of 32 is 2, because we looked at that a minute ago, and I'm going to cube that. 2 cubed is 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. With this one, going to take the 4th root of 81 and then cube that. 4th root of 81 is what number times by itself, times by itself, times by itself, again gives me 81, which is 3. And then I need to cube that. So we've got 3, and then we're going to cube it. 3 cubes, 27.